We're going to hand over now to Darren Moon, who's also works in the Eden Centre. He's a senior learning technologist, and he's going to chair our first panel, which is on digital skills and digital media. Over to you, Darren.
Thanks very much, Claire. Wonderful to see so many of you in attendance this afternoon. It's a really packed education forum, and it's great to see old and new faces alike. Fantastic work from the scheduling team, planning the education forum, coming off the back of Stella's introduction to digital education futures. We've got two fantastic projects to highlight here, which are most definitely not about a curriculum shift response and aren't about moving the institution online, but are actually really focused on the benefit that we bring to students' education of engaging with critical digital media literacies. We've got two wonderful projects here which really demonstrate the value to us of educators of engaging around critical media literacy debates and how we can make use of audio and visual media for teaching and assessment in the classroom. This is an area that the Eden Centre has been engaged with for a while. We obviously have our Atlas offerings around using audiovisual media for assessment, around creating pre-recorded content for lectures, and we've also run a number of projects using the Eden Catalyst Fund to support departments who want to do this type of work. But it continues to be a growth area, and without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Megan Laws, who's our first presenter in this session, to talk to us about her recent work on the AM 102 course.
Thank you so much, Darren, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm going to share my screen if I can. If I can. Let's try this. This full screen. Right, can everyone see that? Yeah. So hi, yes, I'm Megan Laws from the Department of Anthropology, and today I'm going to speak for 5 minutes, hopefully I won't go too much over time, about some of the work that I've been doing on a course that I teach and that Darren Moon has been helping me with. So Darren Moon, as said, is a senior learning technologist at the Eden Centre, and we've been working together to kind of both to work on this course that I've been teaching for the past 2 years, but also to think ahead of how we might, or I might do things differently on the course, and how the Department of Anthropology might sort of change its approach to teaching this particular course. So the course that I teach, I just want to check, is the, can everyone see the full slides? Because
yeah, we can.
It's not kind of cut off with faces and things. Okay, cool. So yes, I teach a course in the Department of Anthropology. It's a core course for first year students in social anthropology, undergraduates, called the Anthropology Text and Film. And this is a course that has run for a very long time. It's had various different names, but the emphasis has always been on allowing students to kind of, or encouraging students somehow, or helping students to develop the ability to kind of think critically about ethnographic writing and filmmaking. So it's been a course that sort of sits alongside two other courses, one based a very theoretical course where they sort of students learn about anthropological theory, and then another course which is much more about ethnography, so kind of key concepts in anthropology. And this one is very much about media, and it's historically kind of focused on text and film, but it's sort of expanded more recently to include other media such as games, photography and sound. And another key kind of aim of this course was to allow students to, alongside kind of learning about media and how anthropologists engage with media, is to develop a kind of detailed knowledge of 3 important texts and films, and a kind of rounded view of the settings within each of them. So they would sort of be matched, a film and a book that sort of fit with one another. And so the students at the end of it would not only know something about the content of those books, those films, but they would also know something about how they were kind of put together and what the differences were between kind of working with text or or working with film. So I joined 2 years ago as a fellow, and one of the key things that I wanted to try to do was to expand the course a bit, so sort of change the way that we teach AN 102 so that students don't only kind of learn about the content of the book or learn about kind of engagements with different media, but actually develop the ability to kind of apply their critical understanding to the production of their own ethnographic media, right? So this was part of me kind of thinking about how I saw students on their kind of journey, and trying to shift the way that they saw themselves, I suppose, as well, from being, you know, young people who are being tested on their knowledge or their critical abilities, to young people who actually wanted to end up having some, you know, wanted to say something at the end of their 3 years and wanted the skills to be able to actually do that, or had some sense of the challenges that they might face when they actually go about trying to put their own, you know, pieces of writing together, or trying to put short films together and that sort of thing. So it required a bit of rethinking of the course, and about the course and about the way that we teach it, and especially the way that we assess it, this is the bit that's a real work in progress, because the assessment hasn't changed yet, but I'm working on it. And one of those things is to rethink what the best way is to kind of assess the students' ability to actually think critically about engagements with media, right? So that first slide said that's always been a key component of this course, but how do we actually assess their ability to do that? And you know, from my own perspective, getting students to actually have a go at producing something themselves is quite a good way to you know, kind of get them thinking, applying their critical understanding, and then for us to then assess that as well. But also another part of it is, you know, when assessing their kind of detailed knowledge of an ethnographic issue or area, it's a very different experience. And this is something that I'm learning more and more as I try to teach this course. It's a very different experience to try to think about how to express an idea practically than it is to sort of just explore how somebody else has done it, right? Because you're then sort of confronted with the multiple different possibilities in front of you, and you really have to think about, well, how might I go about that, and what sort of challenges would I face? So and I think this is significant because, and I've added a little note here, students in anthropology, at least, they don't learn about ethnographic methods until their second year. And so what this course does is it introduces them to kind of the three different parts of the kind of scientific process, thinking about their own development as scholars. It sort of gets them to think about not only the production of ideas, right, the ethnographic issues or research areas, but also the act of, you know, going out and collecting that stuff if they're working with a camera or working with, you know, field notes, and then thinking about how they would express those ideas to others in different, you know, working with different media. So it really it kind of gives them that kind of holistic sense of what it involves to be a scientist, which is sort of what, or be an anthropologist, which is what I felt was particularly important. So yes, 2 years ago, I started collaborating with the Eden Centre. So I applied for an Eden Catalyst Fund, and I started working with Darren Moon to develop a series of practical training sessions that we could run alongside the course material that had already been developed. And we ran these throughout the pandemic, and we're running these this year as well. And they introduce students to the basics in photography and in audio recording and in film as well. But it also, you know, this involved the use of digital tools. And here I'm thinking about what Stella said. It wasn't just about the online. Obviously, it involves the use of digital tools because they're working with cameras and that sort of thing. But last year, when we couldn't work with cameras, we also then we used a bunch of online cameras, simulators. Darren had put together some guides on working with different software, that sort of thing. So there was a lot of work that we were doing to kind of put together sort of digital you know, media and resources for students that I think will form an important part of this course going forward. So yeah, the three big things that I think came through were, or questions that I have that I'm figuring out is, you know, how can I kind of better facilitate independent student learning using digital platforms? So that's a key part of this, was to say having it online and using different resources is actually quite helpful for students, because they can go away and apply, you know, pick up the bits that they think are most important. So if they're most interested in film, they can really focus on that area. If they're most interested in sound, they can do that. Thinking about how to teach students about the use of different media when they're collecting, analyzing, and sharing knowledge. And then finally, how to help students collaborate with one another, either in person or online, and also how to collaborate with others. And this last point was really key for me, because it was something, this is sort of how I came into this, is that I wanted to continue to collaborate with the people that I did my ethnographic research with, and actually digital media seemed like a really good way of doing that. And I started to think about what sort of platform might actually allow me as an anthropologist to collaborate with people on research projects, rather than just kind of use them as sources of data in that sense. So this got us thinking about what to do, and Darren and I came up with this idea of the Ethnographer's Playbook, which is based on a book, or the title is based on a book called The Photographer's Playbook. And the idea is to create a kind of challenge-based platform, so an online kind of challenge-based platform, a sort of, you know, crowdsourcing type inspired platform that would allow would-be ethnographers. So I've used that instead of students, because I think this would be a resource kind of across the school, and not just for anthropologists really. Both to learn about different media, so actually to learn about photography and about different techniques and genres, just like we've been doing and kind of developing the content for, but also to form kind of communities of practice by asking questions and then solving those problems collectively online. So you can form a community of practice around a research question, or around a particular form of media, whatever it is, and then you can work together to kind of play around and see what the effects are of different techniques and conventions and that sort of thing. And these can either be a few that we kind of give to people as examples, which is how we've taught AN 102 this year, or students or would-be ethnographers can come up with them themselves and kind of then form their own communities of practice that way. So yes, that's what we've been doing. I think do I have any time?
Megan, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Great. That's really great, and it's been a great project to work on with you, and it's fantastic to see this kind of ethnographic research practice being embedded right at the beginning of first-year undergraduate anthropology study. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Our next course that we'd like to highlight in this first panel is Ian Madison, whose work on the DV462 course, and particularly the Refugee Realities podcast project, is up next. Ian, where are you? There you are on my Zoom screen. Right, and I'll hand over to Ian, and yes, very much looking forward to hearing about this.
Great, thanks Darren. Just a warning, I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so if I have a bit of a coughing fit over the next few minutes, apologies in advance. And thanks, Megan. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I think, I don't know about you, but I also I get a sense that you found it really rewarding and motivating working with students in this way, and it's certainly something that I would really reiterate as well. So I want to talk about two things that kind of happened by mistake in some ways, and they're within the context of a course I was teaching on. I'm also an LSE fellow in the Department of International Development, and I'm teaching on a course called Refugees and Forced Migration. It's a big course. It takes in students from a lot of different departments. So last year, I think we had about 150 students, and it's a master's level course. So Last year, there were two components to this. The first one was called the Film Club. And then this kind of morphed into what became the Refugee Realities podcast project. And with the Film Club, there were really two motivations behind this. The first was that all of us remember the context of COVID and everyone kind of being at home and having this university experience through their computer screens, which is interesting, but kind of lacks some important stuff. So one of the main ideas was to build a sense of community around a really topical issue. The issue of refugees is front and center in our media landscape. There's a lot of films and documentaries getting produced around this. And a lot of the students taking this course are coming from volunteering backgrounds, have worked in refugee camps or in these contexts, and are really passionate about this. So that was the first thing, kind of build a bit of community around like a weird kind of COVID context by kind of watching films together and talking about them afterwards. Then the second aspect of that was a little more kind of educational. That was, taking this topical material, kind of interrogating our response to it, having a bit of an analysis of how the material was presented, and then linking it back to the course content, and to kind of draw on the tools that we're getting out of the reading list to kind of pick apart some of the issues that are getting talked about in these films. So this came about with a lot of help from Leanne in the Eden Center and an Eden Catalyst grant. We watched 5 films over the course of the term. Each film was selected to kind of relate in some way to the themes that we've been covering in the course up until then. And the other idea was that they should be diverse. So there were films covering like a bird's eye perspective of the so-called migrant crisis, all the way to a remarkable documentary that was filmed by an Afghan refugee completely on his own iPhone, documenting his journey from Afghanistan into Hungary. So a really kind of bottom-up perspective that added something I think really important to the course. So this wasn't really about refugees. This was content that was kind of produced by and from refugees in a lot of ways. And that was, I felt like, an important perspective to add to kind of complement the academic material. Okay, so that was really successful and rewarding, I found. My sense was, though, that students didn't want to just kind of consume this material. They also wanted to kind of produce material as well. And after a lot of kind of brainstorming and scrabbling, this is all in hindsight, it comes across as a kind of clean sequence, but it was really messy when we were doing this. We came up with this idea of having a podcast project. So the basic idea with the podcast project was really go out, interview someone who's relevant to the course, and produce a 20-minute podcast. We're going to release this in time for the UK's Refugee Week, which is around the end of June, and that's in the lead up to World Refugee Day. So there were some parameters. So we had strict kind of time limits to focus on. We had a target date. Students had to kind of apply to do the project to me, which meant they had to identify somebody who was appropriate and give me a sense of what kind of questions they were going to ask. And so on. We also had some support that we offered. Primarily, this was through a wonderful session put on by the Eden Center, Leanne and Chris, which went over the kind of nitty-gritty of producing and planning a podcast, and then the technical aspects around editing stuff on Audacity. And then I spoke a little bit about the kind of ethics of reaching out to people, in particular, the kind of power relationships at play. Aside from that, though, it was really up to the students to do this. This was a voluntary project. It was up to them. We were a little concerned that not many people would bite, but in the end, we ended up getting 11 completed projects. I'll share my screen with you right now just to give you a sense what they looked like. Here we go. So this is the kind of really nice landing page, I guess, that Leanne helped produce for the final product. So the Refugee Realities podcast series gives a little description. As I mentioned, in total, there's 11 completed projects. We separated and sorted these into particular themes. So you can see here, there's 5 different themes that these podcasts kind of naturally fell into. I didn't try and determine this beforehand. It was just kind of arose out of the process, which was a little bit serendipitous, I think. So if you click on one of these, it brings you to this. This is one of the themes within the project. So here's 2 of the students who did it. The overall theme gives a bit of a background, what we're talking about for this kind of day's podcast release. And then it gives a little bio of each student, and then a little tidbit around what the podcast is about, who they're talking to, the basic topics that they're touching upon, and then a link to where it's hosted. And then finally, after this, we also had one of our students who was kind enough to produce a blog that kind of reflected on the whole experience of putting together the podcast. And this was a really interesting kind of aspect that gave a sense of the student level perspective of what it was like, what they kind of got out of it, the challenges they kind of encountered, and so on. So that's the gist of it. That's still hosted on the Eden Center. You can have a look at that if you're interested. So
Ian, that's absolutely wonderful. I'm sorry to jump in, but I'm
not a problem.
I'm really hopeful that we'll have time for at least a couple of questions before we move on with the rest of the program. That was absolutely fantastic to hear. We've got a question in the chat from Dilly. Dilly, I don't know if you want to ask this yourself or if you have.
I'm happy to.
Here we go.
Yeah. So fabulous presentations and projects entirely from you both. Thank you so much. Just really my question was, I mean, I know from personal experience and from research and all sorts of things, just how enthused and passionate students can get about being producers and creators and, you know, working together in these kind of creative spaces. What experiences have you had though of students who are a bit more reluctant and maybe feel more nervous or less equipped to do those sorts of things? And if so, just briefly, are there any sort of tips that you could provide for or recommendations you could provide for colleagues?
Yeah, Megan, do you want to jump in on that first?
You can go first.
Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question, Dilly, and I have to admit, I think that in a way that was a bit of a weak point with this project because it was voluntary. So both the film club and the podcast project were voluntary, and in a way, there might have been students out there who were kind of interested in doing something like this, but ultimately felt a bit inhibited or nervous about it. We certainly had students who volunteered and still felt nervous about it and were nervous. They hadn't interviewed anyone before, they hadn't put together a podcast. And that just required a bit of extra support on our end to kind of help them along. But yeah, it's kind of an open question to me as well. I'm kind of concerned about those students who would have been interested in taking part, but never kind of work themselves up to do it and take that risk. So it's something we're thinking about going forward, certainly.
Yeah, I think I had a similar thing. We actually, because this wasn't part of the assessment initially, the kind of practical training sessions and the projects, I kind of felt like I had to make it voluntary as well, just to manage student workloads. And so yeah, I had a few students who were really keen, and then other students who were really keen, but then you could see after being really keen in the beginning, kind of trailed off when they realized that this was really hard and they didn't know kind of how to go about it. So one of the things that we thought of was, well, initially I said, come up with your own ideas and submit them to me, and lots of students did that, but even students who did do that kind of then sort of found that it was really difficult to actually execute those ideas. They were kind of too ambitious. So one of the ways that we tried to support students who were more nervous was through the creation of prompts this year. So instead of sort of having it just open what the students would do, we could say, well, you can come up with your own idea for a project, but we'll also give you these prompts that are related to the content. So the prompt would be something like, you know, so-and-so talks about personal narratives in such and such a text that we read, you know, go and take a photograph of somebody and then tell us how they, you know, talk to them about how they would narrate the photograph, and then they kind of can apply some of their some of the stuff that they've learned, but they don't have to sort of do all the work that's quite stressful. You know, it's sort of been laid out for them a bit. So that was one way we kind of tried to address that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Megan. I wonder if we have any more questions? Any hands? Well, thank you both so much. Those presentations were really interesting, both fantastic projects. Ian mentioned about use of Audacity to support the DV462 podcasting project. Before I give up my time as chair, it would be remiss of me not to mention that we've been working with colleagues in LSE DTS over the last couple of months to make available a variety of open source creative applications, of which Audacity is one. So now across all of the LSE managed PCs and Macs, staff and students have access to Audacity, which is a very good audio editor, Shotcut for doing basic film editing, and what is also called GIMP. Yes, you heard me correctly. GIMP is the GNU image manipulation program, and it is an open source Photoshop alternative. So we've got 3 fantastic open source applications now, which are available across the school. Thanks very much. That's all from me, and we'll move on now with the rest of the program.